What is a torque? Torque is a measure of the rotational force that causes an object to turn or rotate around a pivot point or axis. It is typically measured in units of pound-feet, lb/ft, or newton-meters, nanometer. Types of torques. Here are some common types of torques. 1. Static torque, a torque that does not cause rotation, but instead holds an object in place. A typical example of static torque is the torque applied to a lug nut on a wheel when using a wrench to loosen or tighten it, but the lug nut does not actually turn. 2. Dynamic torque, a torque that causes rotation or acceleration of an object. A typical example of dynamic torque is, when you pedal a bicycle, you apply a force to the pedals, which creates a torque that causes the crankshaft to rotate. This rotation is then transmitted to the wheels, propelling the bicycle forward. 3. Starting torque, the initial torque required to start moving an object from rest. A typical example of starting torque is the torque required to start a car from a standstill. 4. Running torque, the torque required to maintain the motion of an object. A typical example of running torque is the torque required to keep a car moving at a constant speed on a flat road. 5. Breakaway torque, the minimum torque required to overcome static friction and start moving an object. A typical example of breakaway torque is the torque required to loosen a rusty or stuck bolt or nut. 6. Frictional torque, the torque required to overcome frictional forces opposing rotation. A typical example of frictional torque is when a cyclist applies the brake to the forward wheel, the bicycle tips forward due to the frictional torque between the wheel and the ground. 7. Torsional torque, a twisting force that causes an object to rotate around its longitudinal axis. A typical example of torsional torque is the torque applied to a drill bit when drilling through a material. 8. Axial torque, a force that causes an object to rotate around its axial axis. A typical example of axial torque is the torque applied to a screw or bolt when tightening or loosening it along its axis. 9. Pulsating torque, a varying torque that changes magnitude and direction periodically. A typical example of pulsating torque is the torque produced by a single-cylinder internal combustion engine. 10. Vibrational torque, a torque that causes an object to vibrate or oscillate. A typical example of vibration torque is the torque produced by an unbalanced washing machine or dryer during the spin cycle. These types of torques are important considerations in various engineering applications, including mechanical, electrical, and aerospace engineering.